that is an incredibly important point. That is a massive thread in my book, and my subsequent work that I've been doing, as well. This idea that since we're having, radically different experiences of reality, the idea of right and wrong and truth and good and evil, all of these related concepts have to be shelved in favor of a very plastic, elastic, malleable way of understanding each other, to allow for people in a dialogic environment to be having different imagined experiences of reality, where real things seem to be happening to them, like getting sick from a pathogen, for example. Maybe that's happening to some people, and to other people, those things don't even exist.
The stories, I mean, oh man, this has been so amazing for me to realize more and more of this. Like, the stories that get embedded in our bodies are so intricate and infinitesimal. There are so many of them, and we don't know how they're changing reality at those levels.
Right, right.
We
We're
have no
perfectly
idea.
willing, science is perfectly willing to talk about some kind of quantum reality with quantum entanglement and butterfly effects and chaos theory and complex adaptive systems and all of this stuff. And yet somehow we still live in a material reality, according to science. It's a joke. It's completely a joke to me. They can't even identify the most basic particles, and they just get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. There's a satire in The World Cult and You, and it's an article that I wrote years ago about this phenomenon where science just keeps chasing matter down into the void, and it just never ever ends because there's no real fundamental particle when everything is just consciousness.
It feels to me like chasing the ideal marketing message, chasing the ideal propagandization. That when I was reading that part of the book, I was like, what does this feel like to me? This feels like if I am the sort of fictional person writing this particular missive, what I'm really trying to do is I'm engaged in an act of persuasion. I want people to listen to me, and I want them to do what I tell them.
Right, right. And I want to control their thought process and the way, they still go about manifesting or not manifesting, depending on their intention, right? If you think you're in a material world, this is the thing. If you think that if you buy into this idea that you live in a material reality, then you don't really have power in that environment.
It's like it slows the
Environment has the
material
power.
down. Or go ahead. I interrupted
Just
you.
to say that in that scenario, the environment has the power. It's the rigid, implacable situation that you find yourself in and subject to, as
Because that's the
opposed to
story.
something that you're actually generating or that we are generating.
Right. Right. We were taught, we talked last time also about matter moving more slowly, changing more slowly in waking life than it does in sleeping, dreaming. But even reality in waking life, the dream traveling we're doing in our waking lives, we've had that slowed down massively by all the stories about how implacable it is, about how rigid those structures are when they need not necessarily be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In the Castanedan shamanism, there's this idea that you have an assemblage point, which is a kind of way of focalizing your creative ability, how you kind of manifest your energy in it. When the assemblage point moves, it changes your perception of reality. And in a de facto way, it changes the reality just by changing, the perception. But what has happened in the modern era is the collective assemblage point has moved to what is called the place of reason. And it's essentially gotten stuck there, and it's extremely hard to move it. And the place of reason is what you're describing, basically, this place where everything seems to be an a priori given situation that can't be changed. It is what it is. And there are immutable laws that you have to deal with. The funny thing is, all of that is simply a point of perception. There are other points of perception that contradict that very notion or those very notions.
So, in the way that the intuitive network has evolved, one of the things that was happening early on that we had to come to terms with was that we had been so cut off from other structures, from other influences, influences we wanted to be in contact with anyway, other resourcing, other understanding, scientific literature, languaging. So we had to rebuild our neural structures on our own without being able to check whether they matched others' experiences of those things. And so there's sort of like a really pure evolution of it from a certain standpoint, although it's really messed with in all of these other ways. And there's a plane going overhead and it's changing my thought process. That's very interesting. The way that we have had to do that has given us a standpoint from which to differentiate from what we are told. That's been really helpful, but also really confusing and often upsetting, because we didn't realize reality worked that way. That we could be telling stories amongst ourselves that would have so much power, even if they radically differed from what we were being told by other sources.
Wow. I think you just are touching on what freaks people out about this model that I'm proposing. It's that there's just no touchstone. There's nothing that constitutes a norm that we can all agree on.
Oh, unless we establish it in relationship with one another.
Right, that's what I'm getting at. That's the only even the touchstones are dialogic imaginings brought about through linguistic interaction.
Yeah, and they can always be changing. They can always be mutable. I have so because of all of that I just described, one of the things is that I have sort of a challenging relationship with the word reason, with the word reasoning, because it is generally connected to the mechanical world kinds of reasoning that we've been taught. And yet I and others have this experience of reasoning ourselves to a position that is diametrically opposed with other people who consider themselves reasonable, reasoning people.
Yes, yes. I just made a note. I'm a little, on my little note-taking software on my computer. Controllable individuals who think they're not. Right?
Ooh.
So all of these people who are being super reasonable and are looking at things, whether they're truthers or scientists or whatever they might be, who think that they are standing in a place of truth and accuracy, logic, objectivity, they're living in a fantasy world, Neo.
It's very sad. It's difficult to process emotionally. It's painful for the body that that's happening. We've been talking recently about how professionals in professional networks have generally been funded and facilitated by financial and economic interests that are aligned with colonial imperialist trafficking interests. And so what professionals are generally taught is, you have now been provided with the most powerful set of tool sets, and you know what you're doing, and you can be really proud of yourself, and you're going to be able to make a lot of money, and you just got to make sure to keep your licenses active, keep your accreditations where, you know, at the level that they're supposed to be, and you're going to be someone who is respected, and you have made it in life. You've succeeded, and this is where you have strived to be your whole life. And they've been mistrained, they've been miseducated, so that when they go into the world to help people, they'll be able to help the people who are sort of most accessible to them, that they can help in certain ways. And then there's a threshold of severity and trauma beneath which they have absolutely no idea what to do. And when they're confronted with that, what they're being confronted with is that they've been lied to, is that their professional training has erased the bottom half of the colonial imperialist balance sheet, the bottom half of the capitalist balance sheet. We're doing really great up here. We're just going to ignore all of these bleeding, broken bodies that our success is built on. And so there, I mean, one of the first touch points for us was the suicide rate of medical professionals. And like, why are doctors committing suicide? Well, here's a really good reason. They've been trained in ways that actually cause them to ignore and have to protect themselves from the most harmed people, the people who need the most. These are people who went into their profession to help others. And
Yes.
yet what they've been trained in causes them to dissociate. Oh, goosebumps, dissociate from the people who most need their help, where they could be making the most powerful difference. That's hard. That's so hard. My prayers and love for those people dealing with that.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I have some personal experience when I first got really sick that set me off on my regenetics journey of self-healing. I, I was having all kinds of bizarre physical symptoms. I mean, really bizarre, like allergies and autoimmune types of symptoms and twitches and spasms and just all kinds of craziness. And of course, I went to just a doctor in, my local health clinic, and I was told I was depressed and prescribed antidepressants, that was the solution. And wow, that was such an amazing wake-up call to the inadequacies of the medical system. And then as time went by, I began seeing similar inadequacies across all professional disciplines. I mean, to even use the word discipline is pretty funny, because you're being disciplined in your thinking when you go into any of those, right? And so I think this is one of the reasons I never really came out the other side of graduate school and had to drop out. Yes, I was really sick, but I couldn't stand the thought policing that went on at that level. And this was decades ago, before it got really bad. I mean, it's really, really bad now, and it was already pretty bad then. And I realized I can't, if I do this and I enter this profession. And profession's another funny thing. It's almost like confessing something, to profess like, I'm a bad person, or I'm not an individual, whatever. I don't know what you're professing, but I realized that my mind would never be my own again, and my creativity would never be my own again.
And it does seem that there are people who feel a lot of thriving in those structures if it happens to be aligned well enough for them. But do they really want to silo themselves in environments that would wipe out their ability to broaden beyond that? That's so unfortunate to me. And there are certainly professionals. There are some wonderful, wonderful professionals out there, but they are struggling with their professional networks. They're not sure if they can maintain their livelihood. They're not sure if they even want to maintain their licensing. Like, there are all of these things going on for professional people, where they're having to make very hard decisions about who they want to be in the world and what it's going to take for them to show up as themselves.
Yep, that's exactly where all of this is gone. And I just picked up on it early on when I saw, you know, to be what it really meant to be an academic in the humanities was to essentially become inhuman in many ways.
And
It
the
was
human.
it was exactly, it was to drop any kind of um humanism, any kind of any of the older ideas about our identity as people, as creators, things that we had inherited from, like the 1800s and romanticism and that sort of thing. All of that was being eviscerated. And the study of literature, for example, was basically turning into a pseudoscience based in kind of sociology and psychology. It had no longer anything to do with creativity, the creative process, the hero's journey, none of it. All of that was bunk. And you had to subscribe to these soulless ideas to actually find a place in the academy.
Yeah.
And
And
this is 5 years ago, I mean, that's a quarter of
how
a century, 25 years ago,
25 years ago.
it was already happening. And I remember having conversations with other people who were working on their PhDs and their dissertations, and you know, especially I have to say, especially the men, we were really stuck between a rock and a hard place in a lot of ways, because you had to almost become like a feminist and communist to succeed in academia.
And those things by some pretty toxic definitions. I mean, there are people who use those words in a very different way than the establishment has used them.
Yeah, I'm saying that
And
but regardless, whatever spectrum you are on, with respect to those terms, they are really narrow boxes for thinking and behaving and writing and publishing. And so they're basically giving you an identity that you have to adopt for yourself.
yeah.
And under no circumstances, in my imagination, can that ever be a good thing.
Well, no, we have to be able to learn from one another. We have to be able to have our natural, emergent, creative processes about what's happening in relationship. But this is sort of a funny thing that I have with words too. I mean, am I in relationship with somebody who's controlling me, who's trying to control me? Is that relationship? It's maybe a kind of relationship, but it's not relationship. It's not relationality that is true, that has integrity. It doesn't include me
Right.
if I'm being controlled by it. And so it strips away the very basis of life energy is relational.
Absolutely. We're talking about cults again. Academics is a massive cult, and it has many subcults in the different disciplines, and it's related to other subcults in the different professions. It just goes on and on and on. And no, you are really not included in a cult. You're never included in a cult. You are co-opted by a cult.
You're turned into a bot.
Oh, by a cult. You're turned into a bot. You are restricted, and loosed. Your energy is extracted from you, your power. And this is back to, what do I do, when in the world, and how do I take back my power? So in the world cult and you, as you know, I have strategies for things not to do and strategies of things to do in relation to generating or accumulating more personal power. And there's a lot of things that you don't do. You pull out of as many cults as you can, especially early on when you're trying to gather your personal power. When you do that, there's a natural accumulation of power.